take a moment to subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps this channel grow. I appreciate your support. Now let's dive into today's story.
My stepfather pulled me by the wrist through the rain toward a man sitting against a shuttered storefront, a worn blanket over his shoulders, a paper cup with a handful of coins in front of him. "This is her," Byung-cheol said, not to me, but to the man on the ground, as though I were an item being handed across a counter. "She cooks, she cleans, she doesn't complain. In exchange, you forget the 8 million won I owe your associates. That's the deal." I stood there in the rain, 24 years old, staring down at a man who looked, by every visible measure, like he had nothing at all: worn shoes, a thin coat, the particular stillness of someone who'd spent considerable time on the street. I felt something in me go numb, the specific numbness of understanding, all at once, exactly how little I actually meant to the man who'd raised me for the past 15 years. The man on the ground looked up at me slowly. I want you to understand exactly what I saw in his eyes in that moment, because it mattered enormously to everything that happened afterward, not the desperation I expected from someone in his apparent circumstances, but something considerably calmer, more assessing, the specific stillness of someone taking in a situation far more carefully than his surroundings suggested he had any reason to. "Your name," he said to me quietly, ignoring my stepfather entirely. "Seoul," I said, my voice barely audible over the rain. He nodded once, then looked at my stepfather with an expression I didn't fully understand yet. 8 million won, he repeated. "That's what you believe a person is worth to you." My name is Seoul Park, and I stood in that alley believing I was being handed over to a man with absolutely nothing, my stepfather's cruelty finally reaching its lowest possible point after 15 years of quiet neglect and, in recent months, outright exploitation. Before I tell you what happened 40 minutes later, once we'd left that alley, because the black car that pulled up to the curb left my stepfather standing in the rain utterly speechless, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, nothing about this story is what it first appears to be. The man rose slowly from the ground, folding the worn blanket with a specific, unhurried care, and looked directly at my stepfather. "Walk with us," he said. "I think you should see exactly who you just tried to sell your daughter to." I had no idea, following that quiet, composed stranger out of that alley, exactly whose protection I had actually just been placed under, or exactly how completely my stepfather's cruelty was about to collide with a truth he could never have anticipated. I want to take you back to the beginning, because understanding exactly what 15 years under my stepfather's roof had actually looked like matters enormously to understanding why that alley felt, in a strange way, like the natural conclusion of a pattern rather than a sudden, isolated cruelty. My mother married Byung-cheol when I was 9 years old, 2 years after my biological father passed from a sudden illness. I want to be honest that my early memories of Han were not entirely unkind. He was, in those first years, a reasonably attentive stepfather, present at school events, generally civil in his treatment of me, even if genuine warmth never fully developed between us. The shift began gradually, roughly 4 years into the marriage, when Han's small import business began struggling against larger competitors entering the market. I want to walk you through the specific texture of that decline, because it shaped everything that followed. He grew increasingly short-tempered, increasingly resentful of any financial obligation that didn't directly serve his own business's survival, a resentment that, over the following years, began extending specifically toward me. My mother passed when I was 17, a loss that devastated me completely and, I understand now with painful clarity, removed the last meaningful check on Han's treatment of me. I want to be honest about the specific years that followed her death, because they shaped the particular vulnerability that eventually led to that alley. Han made clear, in the months following my mother's funeral, that he considered his financial obligation to me effectively concluded alongside her death, despite having legally adopted me years earlier during a period when demonstrating that commitment had served his own interests within my mother's family. I worked through my final years of school largely supporting myself, taking part-time jobs that left little room for the kind of academic focus that might have opened more opportunities afterward. I want to walk you through why, even as an adult, I remained financially entangled with Han's household rather than fully independent, because I think it matters to understanding the specific vulnerability that led to that alley. I worked as a junior accountant at a small firm, earning modestly but consistently, still living in Han's apartment primarily because Seoul's housing costs made full independence considerably more difficult than my income alone could comfortably support. I want to be honest that I understood, even before his business debts fully spiraled, that Han viewed my continued presence in his household less as family obligation and more as a convenient arrangement he could leverage whenever it served him, covering portions of shared expenses, handling household responsibilities he no longer wanted to manage himself, all while offering vanishingly little warmth or genuine care in return. I want to walk you through how Han's business debt escalated in the months before that alley, because understanding its severity matters to understanding exactly how desperate and morally compromised he'd become by the time he made the decision that led us there. His import business had taken on considerable debt from increasingly unreliable lenders, eventually including a private lending network with looser, more dangerous terms than any legitimate bank would have extended. I learned, only weeks before that rainy alley confrontation, that Han owed roughly 8 million won to this network, a debt that had grown considerably from its original amount through accumulated interest and penalties. I had no idea, in those final weeks, exactly how far Han was actually prepared to go to settle that debt, or exactly how little consideration he was about to give to what settling it would actually cost me. I want to walk you through the specific days leading up to that confrontation, because the deliberateness of Han's plan revealed a level of calculation I hadn't previously believed him capable of. Han informed me, for days before that alley, that he'd found a solution to his debt situation, offering no further detail beyond instructing me to be ready to leave the apartment with him that coming weekend. I want to be honest about the specific dread I felt receiving that instruction, some instinct already warning me that whatever solution he'd found likely involved using me as leverage in some capacity, though I couldn't yet have imagined the specific, degrading form that leverage would ultimately take. I confronted him directly the following day, asking plainly what exactly this solution involved. "You don't need the details," he told me. "Just understand that you owe this family for 15 years of housing and support, and it's time you actually contributed something meaningful toward settling what I owe." I want to walk you through what I eventually learned about the specific arrangement Han had constructed, pieced together over the following days from fragments of overheard phone calls. Han had been in contact with an intermediary connected to the lending network he owed money to, a contact who'd apparently suggested, almost casually, that Han could resolve his debt through alternative means if he had assets beyond simple cash repayment. I want to be honest about the specific horror of understanding, gradually, that Han had interpreted this suggestion as an opportunity to offer me, essentially, as payment, arranging what he described to the intermediary as a marriage of convenience to someone within the network's orbit, believing this arrangement would satisfy his debt while requiring nothing further of him personally. I want to walk you through that final morning, because the specific coldness of Han's instructions revealed exactly how little he'd actually considered my own humanity throughout this entire process. "There's a man waiting near the old market district," he told me. "He's been told to expect you. Don't embarrass this family by making a scene." I want to be honest that I considered, in those final hours, simply refusing to go, running instead to a friend's apartment or anywhere else that might offer temporary safety. I stayed, ultimately, out of a specific, exhausted resignation I'm not proud of, understanding that Han's debt to this dangerous lending network would likely escalate into danger for both of us regardless of my own choices, and hoping, foolishly, that whatever arrangement awaited me might prove less catastrophic than my fear was suggesting. I want to walk you through the specific, disorienting moment of arriving at that alley, because nothing about the man Han pointed me toward matched whatever image I'd constructed in my own anxious imagination over the preceding days. I'd expected, if anything, someone considerably more menacing in appearance, not a man sitting quietly against a shuttered storefront in worn clothing, looking, by every visible measure, like someone with nothing at all to offer either of us. I had no idea, standing in that rain moments before Han's cruel introduction, exactly how completely my own assumptions, and Han's, were about to be upended, or exactly whose protection I was actually about to fall under. You already witnessed the core of that alley confrontation, Han's cruel introduction, the man's quiet assessment, his simple instruction that we walk with him. I want to walk you through what happened over the following 40 minutes, because every detail mattered enormously to understanding exactly who I'd actually been handed over to. I want to walk you through the specific, unsettling quality of that walk, because Han's confidence began visibly eroding within the first several minutes. The man led us 3 blocks from the alley, his posture straightening gradually with each step, his worn blanket discarded in a nearby donation bin along the way, revealing, beneath his apparent poverty, a bearing considerably more composed and deliberate than anything Han had clearly anticipated. "Where exactly are we going?" Han asked, his earlier confidence audibly cracking, some instinct apparently warning him that this situation had already moved considerably beyond his control. "I want to walk you through the specific moment everything changed irrevocably, because it happened with a suddenness that left Han visibly stunned." A black sedan pulled to the curb ahead of us, and 2 men in dark, well-tailored suits emerged immediately, greeting the man beside me with a deference that made unmistakably clear he held considerably more authority than his alley appearance had suggested. "Mr. Jang," one of the men said, inclining his head respectfully, "we weren't expecting you back until this evening." "I want you to understand the specific moment." Han's face drained of color entirely, hearing that name. "Jang," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Jang Minho?" I want to walk you through exactly who Jang Minho actually was, because understanding the scope of his actual position mattered enormously to understanding exactly how thoroughly Han's cruel scheme had collided with something considerably beyond his comprehension. Jang controlled one of Seoul's most influential private investment and logistics networks, a legitimate, powerful business empire that also maintained close, complicated ties to exactly the kind of private lending operations Han had foolishly entangled himself with. I learned, in the minutes that followed, that Jang periodically moved through the city incognito, specifically to observe, firsthand and without the filtering effect of his own reputation, how his organization's various financial dealings actually played out on the ground, a practice, I would later understand, that had led him directly to that alley purely by circumstance, sitting quietly near the exact lending network intermediary Han had been dealing with, observing rather than participating in whatever transaction unfolded nearby. Jang's direct address to Han. Jang turned to face Han directly, his voice carrying a specific, controlled authority I hadn't yet heard from him. "You offered your stepdaughter as payment toward a debt to my organization," he said, "believing you were negotiating with a man who had nothing. I want you to sit with that for a moment. You were prepared to sell a human being for 8 million won to a stranger you assumed was desperate enough to accept her." I had no idea, watching Han's composure fully collapse in that moment, exactly how completely Jang intended to address both his debt and his cruelty, or exactly what protection I was actually about to receive from a man who'd revealed, in the span of a single conversation, considerably more genuine decency than my own stepfather had shown me in over a decade. I want to walk you through exactly what Jang decided to do once the full scope of Han's scheme became clear, because his response revealed considerably more nuance than a simple, dramatic punishment might have offered. "The debt is cancelled," Jang said, turning to address Han directly. "Not because you've earned any leniency, but because I have no interest in your money, and considerably less interest in ever seeing your face associated with my organization again. You will find another lender, or you will restructure your business entirely, but you will never again attempt to use a human life as currency within any network connected to me." I want to walk you through Han's reaction to this, because it revealed exactly the specific cowardice underlying his earlier cruelty. He stammered some version of gratitude, still visibly processing the scope of what he'd nearly done, though I want to be honest that his relief seemed to focus considerably more on his own financial deliverance than on any genuine remorse for what he'd attempted to do to me. I want to walk you through what Jang said to me directly once Han's debt situation had been addressed, because it revealed exactly the character underlying his considerable power. "You are not obligated to return to this man's household," he told me. "What happens next is entirely your choice, not his, and not mine either. I can offer resources if you need them, but I want to be clear that I'm not asking anything of you in return." I want to be honest about the specific, overwhelming relief I felt hearing that clarity, having spent the entire walk from that alley uncertain whether I'd simply been transferred from one form of exploitation into another, however less openly cruel it might have initially appeared. I want to walk you through the decision I made in that moment, because it mattered enormously to everything that followed. I told Jang I needed somewhere safe to stay while I figured out my next steps, entirely separate from Han's household. He arranged, within the hour, for temporary housing through a legitimate property management company connected to his broader business holdings, along with contact information for an employment counselor who specialized, I later learned, in helping women transition out of exactly the kind of precarious, exploitative family situations I'd just escaped. I want to be honest about what happened to Han in the following months, because I don't want to suggest Jang's intervention resulted in some dramatic, violent punishment. Han's business ultimately failed regardless of the canceled debt, undone by the same poor decisions and financial mismanagement that had led him into that dangerous lending network in the first place. I heard, through distant family contacts, that he eventually relocated to a smaller city, working considerably more modest employment than the business he'd once run. I had no idea, accepting Jang's offer of temporary housing and genuine, no-strings-attached support, exactly how much my entire life was about to change over the following year, nor did I know exactly what kind of relationship, entirely different from anything Han had ever offered me, I was about to build with the man who'd first appeared, deceptively, as nothing more than a stranger sitting in the rain. I want to walk you through the year that followed, because the specific texture of Jang's continued support mattered enormously to understanding exactly how thoroughly my life changed once I was finally free of Han's exploitation. I want to be honest about how deliberately I approached rebuilding my own independence during this period, understanding that genuine security required my own sustained effort rather than simply depending indefinitely on Jang's initial generosity. I worked with the employment counselor his organization had connected me with, eventually transitioning from my previous junior accounting position into a considerably stronger role at a mid-sized financial consulting firm, work that better matched both my actual skills and my growing confidence. I want to walk you through the specific quality of Jang's continued presence in my life during this period, because it never once carried the transactional weight I'd initially feared it might. He checked in periodically, genuinely, asking about my progress without ever suggesting any expectation of repayment or obligation for his earlier assistance. I met his own family eventually, including his mother, a formidable, kind woman who took a genuine, grandmotherly interest in my well-being that I hadn't experienced from any family member in years. I want to be honest and direct about the actual nature of my relationship with Jang, because I think it matters to understanding this story accurately. What developed between us was not romantic. It became, instead, something I've come to understand as genuine mentorship and protection, the kind of steady, unconditional support I'd never once received from Han, offered by a man whose own considerable power made his choice to extend it without any expectation of return all the more meaningful to me. I want to walk you through a specific conversation we had roughly 8 months after that alley, because it clarified exactly the shape of the relationship we'd built. I don't need you to feel indebted to me, Jang told me, over a quiet dinner where he'd invited me specifically to discuss my career progress. What I saw your stepfather do to you reminded me of choices I watched my own father make decades ago, choices I promised myself I'd never allow to go unaddressed if I ever witnessed them again. Consider this simply the kind of support any decent person should have offered you long before I happened to be sitting in that alley. I want to walk you through where I stand roughly 18 months after that alley confrontation, because the specific independence I built during this period matters enormously to how I understand this entire experience now. I've since been promoted twice at my consulting firm, secured my own modest apartment entirely through my own income, and built a small but genuine circle of friends and colleagues who know me entirely on my own terms, with no connection whatsoever to either Han's household or Jang's considerable influence. I had no idea, in those first disorienting days following that alley, exactly how much genuine strength and independence I was actually capable of building once finally freed from 15 years of quiet exploitation, nor did I know exactly what closure, if any, I'd eventually find regarding my relationship with Han himself. It's been just over 2 years now since that rainy alley, and I want to give you an honest account of where things actually stand, rather than a tidier resolution than real healing usually offers. I want to be honest that I have not reconciled with Han, and I've made peace with the likelihood that I never will. He reached out once, roughly a year after that alley, offering an apology that felt, even reading it, considerably more focused on his own guilt than on any genuine understanding of what he'd actually put me through. I responded briefly, acknowledging his message without offering the forgiveness I don't believe I actually owe him. My relationship with Jang and his family has remained a genuine, steady presence in my life, evolved now into something considerably more like extended family than the initial dynamic of rescuer and rescued that defined our first meeting. I want to be honest that this relationship required its own kind of careful navigation, ensuring that my own growing independence never became overly dependent on his continued support, a boundary Jang himself, to his considerable credit, has consistently respected and even actively encouraged. If you've ever been treated as leverage or currency by someone who should have protected you instead, valued only for what you could provide rather than who you actually are, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who treat you as disposable, certain there will be no consequences for that cruelty, are rarely as perceptive as they believe themselves to be. Han looked at a quiet stranger sitting in the rain and saw only convenient desperation, never once considering that appearances might conceal something considerably more significant than his own narrow assumptions allowed him to imagine. Sometimes the people who fail you most completely reveal, in that exact failure, precisely how little they ever actually understood about value, about worth, or about the human being standing directly in front of them. And sometimes, unexpectedly, the very cruelty meant to discard you becomes the exact circumstance that finally introduces you to the genuine support you deserved all along. Han Byung-cheol stood in that alley, certain he was simply settling a debt by handing his stepdaughter over to a man with nothing left to lose. He had no idea, standing there in the rain, exactly whose protection he was actually placing me under, or exactly how completely his own cruelty was about to be exposed by the very stranger he'd assumed would ask no questions at all.
Thanks for tuning in and watching to the end. Drop your comments below.